When 28-year-old diesel mechanic Jordan Hayes signed the auction papers for a rusted cargo vessel destined for the scrapyard, she thought she was making a desperate gamble to save her failing marine repair business. But welded inside the ship's double hull lay evidence of the largest maritime smuggling operation in Pacific Northwest history. A $76 million cash that would expose 3 generations of corruption and transform the forgotten shipyard town of Port Cascade forever. What powerful families had buried at sea decades ago was about to surface, and they would do anything to keep it hidden. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if stories like this grip you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something even more unbelievable lined up. The early morning mist rolled across Puget Sound like a living thing, thick and grey, swallowing the rusted hulks of forgotten vessels that lined the industrial waterfront of Port Cascade, Washington. Jordan Hayes stood on the cracked concrete of Pier 7, her work boots crunching on scattered pebbles of corroded metal, staring up at the MV Pacific Destiny. The cargo ship loomed above her like a steel cathedral gone to seed, 400 feet of rust-streaked hull that hadn't moved under its own power in 8 years. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries echoing off the vessel's massive superstructure. And somewhere in the distance, a foghorn moaned its lonely warning. This wasn't how Jordan had imagined spending her late 20s. When she was 14, full of fire and determination, she'd told her father she wanted to be a marine mechanic, not a secretary, not a teacher, but someone who worked with her hands rebuilding the massive diesel engines that powered the ships connecting the world. Her father, Thomas Hayes, had looked at her with that particular mixture of pride and concern that only a parent can muster, and said, "Then I guess you better start learning." For the next decade, Jordan had apprenticed under her father at Hayes Marine Services, a family-owned ship repair business that had served Port Cascade for 3 generations. She'd learned to diagnose engine problems by sound alone, to rebuild fuel injectors blindfolded, to weld seams that could withstand the crushing pressure of deep ocean swells. The smell of diesel fuel and hot metal had become her perfume. The rhythm of piston engines had become her heartbeat. When her father died 3 years ago, collapsing in the engine room of a fishing trawler at just 52 years old, Jordan had inherited not just the business, but the weight of keeping a family legacy alive. She'd also inherited $340,000 in debt, medical bills from his final months, equipment loans he'd taken out to keep the business competitive, and a commercial property mortgage that had seemed manageable when Port Cascade still had a thriving maritime industry. But Port Cascade was dying. The town of 12,000 souls clung to the edge of Puget Sound like a barnacle on a sinking ship, watching as corporate shipyards in Seattle and Tacoma swallowed their clients, as shipping routes shifted, as the major companies consolidated operations elsewhere. What had once been a thriving hub of maritime commerce, where a dozen family-owned businesses competed for contracts and the docks ran 24 hours a day, had become a graveyard of rusted cranes and empty warehouses. Hayes Marine Services was bleeding money. In the past year, Jordan had lost 6 major clients to larger operations. Her workforce had shrunk from 12 employees to just 3, herself included. The bank had sent the first foreclosure warning 2 months ago. She'd ignored it, then the second, then the third, each one more insistent, until finally she'd been forced to face the truth. Without a miracle, Hayes Marine would be gone by Christmas. Yesterday's marine salvage auction had been her Hail Mary pass, her last-ditch gamble with stakes she couldn't afford to lose. The Pacific Destiny, A mid-sized cargo vessel abandoned by its Liberian-registered owners after an engine fire in 2017 was being sold for scrap by the Port Authority. The listing had been sparse: 400-foot container vessel, non-operational, sold as is, buyer responsible for removal within 90 days. Jordan's plan had been audacious, bordering on insane. She would bid on the ship, win it for scrap value, then systematically strip it for parts. Marine diesel engines, even damaged ones, could be rebuilt and sold. The ship's brass fixtures, copper wiring and electronics would fetch decent prices from recyclers. The steel hull itself, 2,000 tons of it, would go to a scrap metal dealer who'd already given her a quote. If everything went according to plan, if she could move fast enough and squeeze every dollar of value from the Pacific Destiny, she could clear $400,000, pay off her debts, and buy herself another year to figure out how to save her father's business. It was a plan built on prayer and desperation. She'd bid $180,000, nearly everything she had left, plus a dangerous loan from Marcus Chen's uncle, a private lender whose interest rates were barely legal and whose collection methods were rumored to be considerably less so. The auction had been held in a dingy warehouse office that smelled of mildew and old coffee. 15 people showed up, mostly professional salvage operators who made their living picking apart dead ships. Jordan had been the youngest person in the room by 2 decades, and the only woman. They'd looked at her with a mixture of amusement and pity. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Vogel, with liver spots on his hands and a voice like grinding gears, had rattled through the preliminary information. MV Pacific Destiny, 400 feet, built 1987, South Korean construction, twin diesel engines, container capacity 800 TEU, abandoned 2017 following engine room fire. Current condition unknown, sold as is, no warranties, no guarantees, no liability. The bidding had started at $100,000. 2 salvage operators had jumped in immediately, trading increments back and forth. Jordan had waited, watching, calculating. At $150,000, one dropped out. At $170,000, the other hesitated. Jordan had raised her paddle. $180,000. The room had gone quiet. The remaining salvage operator, a man named Griggs, who owned half the scrapyards in the county, had turned to look at her with narrowed eyes. He'd seemed about to counter, then shrugged and sat back down. Going once, going twice. Vogel had paused, as if expecting someone else to jump in. Sold to Miss Hayes for $180,000. She's all yours, sweetheart. Good luck with her. There had been something in his tone, Jordan thought now, standing before her enormous purchase. Not quite mockery, but something close. Relief, maybe, as if he was glad to be rid of the Pacific Destiny, and happier still that it was someone else's problem now. In the cold light of dawn, with the mist beading on her jacket and the massive hull looming above her like a judgment, the magnitude of her gamble settled over Jordan like a weight. The Pacific Destiny wasn't just big, it was enormous. Every rivet, every deck, every compartment would need to be systematically stripped. She had 90 days before the Port Authority's deadline, 90 days to turn this rusted giant into enough cash to save everything her father had built. The sound of tires on gravel announced Marcus Chen's arrival. His truck, a battered Ford F-250 that had seen better decades, pulled up beside her own vehicle. Marcus emerged carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and a clipboard, his black hair disheveled from sleep. his expression somewhere between concern and resignation. Marcus had been Jordan's friend since elementary school, when he'd punched Kyle Brennan for calling her wrench girl, and she'd returned the favor by teaching Kyle that girls who grew up in machine shops knew exactly where to hit someone to make them stop being stupid. They'd been inseparable ever since, through high school, through her father's death, through the slow collapse of everything they'd known. Marcus worked as her business manager, handling contracts and accounting, while she handled the mechanical work. His degree in business administration from Washington State had been meant to launch him toward Seattle and corporate success. Instead, he'd come back to Port Cascade to help his childhood friends save a dying business, driven by loyalty and stubbornness in equal measure. "Please tell me you have a plan that's more detailed than cut it up and pray," Marcus said, handing her one of the coffees. Jordan accepted it gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around the cup. "I've got 3 weeks before Griggs takes possession of the hull for scrap. We start with the engine room, work our way up through the decks. Anything copper, brass, or salvageable electronics comes out first. Those are immediate cash. The engines come out whole if we can manage it, pieced out if we can't. And the fact that this ship has been sitting here for 8 years with nobody touching it doesn't worry you." Jordan had been thinking about that all night. Port Cascade's salvage operators were usually vultures, descending on abandoned vessels within months, sometimes weeks, stripping anything of value before the Port Authority could even process the paperwork. Yet the Pacific Destiny had sat untouched in its berth for 8 years, slowly rusting, accumulating harbor fees, while salvage operators with decades of experience had apparently looked at it and decided to leave it alone. "Maybe the engine fire scared everyone off," Jordan suggested, though even as she said it, she didn't believe it. Salvage operators weren't scared of fire damage. If anything, distressed vessels often meant desperate owners willing to accept low-ball offers. "Or maybe there's something wrong with it that we don't know about," Marcus countered. "Asbestos, structural damage, legal complications. Only one way to find out." They spent the first hour establishing access to the ship. The main gangway had been removed years ago, leaving only a narrow maintenance ladder welded to the hull. Jordan climbed first, her boots finding purchase on rungs slick with morning dew, hauling herself up 40 feet to the main deck. Marcus followed, breathing hard by the time he reached the top. The main deck was a landscape of rust and neglect. Container tie-downs had corroded into abstract sculptures. Hatches were sealed with chains and padlocks that had fused into solid masses. Everywhere Jordan looked, she saw the evidence of a ship left to die slowly, paint peeling in great sheets, metal oxidizing in layers, pooled water that had frozen and thawed through dozens of winter cycles. But it was still beautiful in its way. The clean lines of the hull, the massive cranes that had once lifted containers, the superstructure rising 7 decks toward the pilot house. It all spoke of engineering excellence, of human ingenuity, bent toward the task of connecting distant shores. Jordan's father had taught her to see beauty in functional design, to appreciate the elegance of machines built to serve a purpose. The Pacific Destiny had been left to rot, but underneath the rust and neglect, it was still a marvel. They started with the hatches. Jordan had brought an angle grinder and a cutting torch. Marcus worked on the chains with bolt cutters, while Jordan cut through padlocks that wouldn't surrender to conventional methods. It took 2 hours to open the first cargo hold. The interior was dark and cavernous, a vast metal cavern that dropped 5 decks deep. Their flashlights barely penetrated the gloom. The air that escaped smelled of salt water, rust and something else, something organic and unpleasant. Jordan descended on a maintenance ladder, testing each rung before trusting it with her weight. The bottom of the hold was flooded with about 3 feet of stagnant water. Empty container frames lined the walls, their surfaces furred with rust, but there was no obvious damage, no signs of catastrophic failure. When 28-year-old diesel mechanic Jordan Hayes signed the auction papers for a rusted cargo vessel destined for the scrapyard, she thought she was making a desperate gamble to save her failing marine repair business. But welded inside the ship's double hull lay evidence of the largest maritime smuggling operation in Pacific Northwest history, a $76 million cash that would expose 3 generations of corruption and transform the forgotten shipyard town of Port Cascade forever. What powerful families had buried at sea decades ago was about to surface, and they would do anything to keep it hidden. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if stories like this grip you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something even more unbelievable lined up. The early morning mist rolled across Puget Sound like a living thing, thick and grey, swallowing the rusted hulks of forgotten vessels that lined the industrial waterfront of Port Cascade, Washington. Jordan Hayes stood on the cracked concrete of Pier 7, her work boots crunching on scattered pebbles of corroded metal, staring up at the MV Pacific Destiny. The cargo ship loomed above her like a steel cathedral gone to seed, 400 feet of rust-streaked hull that hadn't moved under its own power in 8 years. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries echoing off the vessel's massive superstructure. And somewhere in the distance, a foghorn moaned its lonely warning. She moved closer to the main engines, running her hands over the massive cylinder heads, and that's when she noticed something odd. The mounting bolts showed fresh tool marks, bright metal visible where recent wrenches had scraped away oxidation. Someone had accessed these engines recently, far more recently than 8 years ago. Marcus, she called up through the hatch. Bring me the torch and pry bar, and the camera. I need to document this. While Marcus retrieved the tools, Jordan examined the engine room more carefully. There were other anomalies now that she was looking. Access panels that should have been dogged shut were slightly ajar. A tool cabinet in the corner showed signs of recent use, and most telling, a nearly empty bottle of water sitting on a workbench, its label dated 2023. Someone had been maintaining access to this ship, even while it sat officially abandoned. Marcus descended with the equipment. What did you find? Fresh tool marks. Recent water bottle. Marcus, someone's been down here in the last year, maybe the last few months. Salvagers? Maybe, but why leave everything intact? Why not strip it? Jordan moved to the hull, examining the massive steel plates that formed the ship's skin. Container vessels were built with double hulls, an inner hull and outer hull with space between them for ballast water. It was a safety feature, preventing cargo from spilling if the outer hull was breached. She tapped on one of the hull plates with a wrench, listening to the sound. Solid steel produced a distinctive ring. But this section sounded different, duller, as if something was behind it besides the ballast space. Hand me that pry bar. Jordan found a seam in the plating, a place where access panels should have been bolted. But the bolts were welded shut, fresh welds that gleamed silver against the older steel. Someone had sealed this access point recently and deliberately. Jordan, maybe we should just stick to salvaging what we can see, Marcus suggested nervously. Breaking into sealed compartments without knowing what's inside. This is my ship, Marcus. I need to know what I bought. She positioned the pry bar and threw her weight against it. The welds cracked, then gave way. Behind the panel was darkness and the smell of grease. Jordan shined her light inside. The space between the hulls had been modified. Instead of the open ballast tanks she expected, there were welded compartments, custom fabrications that shouldn't exist. And inside one of those compartments, sealed in waterproof containers, were stacks upon stacks of something wrapped in protective cloth. Jordan reached in and pulled one package out. It was heavy, dense. She unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside was a gold bar, stamped with the Sayers marks and serial numbers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jordan's hands trembled as she held the bar, feeling its weight, its impossible reality. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," Marcus whispered. Jordan pulled out her phone, photographing the bar from every angle, documenting the serial numbers. Then she reached back into the compartment and started counting packages. 10 in this section, 20, 30. "Marcus, this isn't just one compartment. Look," she pointed along the hull. "These modifications run the length of the engine room, maybe further." They spent the next hour carefully documenting what they'd found, taking photographs, making notes, not touching more than they had to. Jordan's mind raced, calculating. Gold prices were around $2,000 per ounce. A standard gold bar was 400 ounces, worth about $800,000. If there were dozens of bars, hundreds even, by the time they climbed out of the engine room, the sun was beginning to set, painting the Sound in shades of orange and red. Jordan's hands were still shaking. "We need to report this," Marcus said. "Call the Coast Guard, the police, someone, and tell them what? That we found gold hidden in a ship I just bought. Jordan, this isn't salvage rights. This is, I don't even know what this is. Smuggling, theft, which is why we need to know more before we involve authorities." Jordan looked back at the ship. That gold has been sealed in there for years, maybe decades. Someone went to enormous trouble to hide it, and someone's been maintaining access to this ship, keeping it isolated. The mysterious someone who doesn't want us here. As if summoned by Marcus's words, Jordan's phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Miss Hayes." The voice was smooth, professional, with the cultivated neutrality of someone used to dealing with confidential matters. "My name is Robert Whitmore. I represent certain interests in the maritime industry. I understand you recently acquired the Pacific Destiny at auction." Jordan's guard went up immediately. The auction had been yesterday. How did this person already know? "News travels fast," she said carefully. "In a small community, like Port Cascade, yes. Miss Hayes, I'll be direct. My clients would like to purchase the vessel from you. We're prepared to offer $400,000, cash immediate transfer. You'd clear your debt and make a profit without any of the risk or labor involved in salvage work." It was exactly what she needed to save Hayes Marine. Suspiciously, impossibly, exactly. "Who do you represent?" Jordan asked. A pause barely perceptible. "Clients who prefer to maintain discretion. The offer is time-sensitive, Miss Hayes. We'd need your answer within 24 hours. Why the rush? As I said, we prefer discretion. The longer the vessel remains in your possession, the more complicated the transaction becomes. This is a generous offer for a ship that will cost you considerable time and money to salvage." "I'll think about it," Jordan said. "Please do. But I should mention, Miss Hayes, that salvage work can be dangerous. Old ships contain many hazards. It would be unfortunate if you or your employees were injured during the process. The liability alone could be devastating to a small business." The pleasant tone didn't quite mask the threat underneath. Jordan's grip tightened on her phone. Was that a threat, Mr. Whitmore? Merely a statement of fact. Accidents happen. Good evening, Miss Hayes. I'll call you tomorrow for your decision. The line went dead. Jordan lowered her phone, her heart pounding. Marcus had been watching her face during the conversation. Bad? He asked. Were someone wants this ship badly enough to offer double what I paid, in cash with 24 hours to decide. Which means they know about the gold, or they know about something else we haven't found yet. They stood in the gathering darkness, the Pacific destiny looming above them, like a monument to secrets and lies. Somewhere in Port Cascade, powerful people were watching, waiting, probably planning. Jordan thought about her father, about the business he'd built with his hands and sweat, about the legacy she'd promised to preserve. She thought about the $340,000 in debt, crushing her, about the foreclosure notices stacking up on her desk. Taking Whitmore's offer would solve everything. She'd walk away with a profit, save the business, never know what secrets were welded into that hull. But Jordan Hayes hadn't become a marine mechanic by taking the easy path. She'd learned young that the truth was usually hidden in the parts most people didn't want to examine. That the real story was in the details others overlooked. We go back tomorrow, she decided. But this time we bring proper documentation equipment, cameras, measuring tools, sample containers, and we tell no one what we found. Jordan, this is insane. These people, whoever they are, they're dangerous. My shop is 2 days from foreclosure, Marcus. That gold might be the only way to save it. But more than that, she looked up at the ship. That gold was hidden on an abandoned vessel for a reason. Someone committed crimes, probably serious ones, and they've been getting away with it for years. My father taught me that good mechanics don't just fix what's broken, they figure out why it broke in the first place. Marcus sighed, recognizing the stubborn set to her jaw that meant argument was useless. At least let me call my cousin in the state police, off the record, just to see if this ship has any red flags. All right, but carefully. If the wrong people find out we're asking questions. They gathered their tools and headed back to their vehicles. As Jordan's truck pulled away from Pier 7, she glanced in her rearview mirror. A black sedan sat in the shadows near the warehouse district, its occupants invisible behind tinted windows. Someone was watching. The game had already begun, whether she wanted to play or not. Back at her workshop, a converted warehouse near the old downtown, Jordan couldn't sleep. She sat at her father's desk, surrounded by manuals and maritime law books she'd pulled from his collection, researching salvage rights and maritime treasure law. The legal landscape was complicated. If the gold was legally owned cargo that had been properly manifested, it likely belonged to the ship's last registered owner or their insurance company. But if it was contraband, hidden cargo never declared, then the situation became much murkier. Finders weren't always keepers, but they often had claims to percentages. More importantly, someone had hidden that gold deliberately, sealed it behind welded panels, then orchestrated the ship's abandonment in a way that kept it isolated for nearly a decade. That suggested serious criminal activity, possibly involving people with enough power to manipulate port authorities and salvage auctions. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Cousin says ship is flagged in federal database. Would not say why. Said we should stay away from it. Seemed nervous. Jordan stared at the message. Federal database. Whatever the Pacific destiny was involved in, it went beyond local salvage disputes. A knock on her workshop door made her jump. She checked her security camera. A woman stood outside, maybe 60 years old, wearing an expensive coat that looked out of place in this industrial neighborhood. Jordan opened the door cautiously. Can I help you, Miss Hayes? My name is Catherine Aldridge. I believe we need to talk about the ship you purchased yesterday. It's late, Miss Aldridge. Yes,
which should tell you how important this is. The woman's eyes were sharp, intelligent. May I come in? What I have to tell you concerns your safety and the future of Port Cascade. Against her better judgment, Jordan stepped aside. Against her better judgment, Jordan stepped aside. Catherine Aldridge entered, glancing around the workshop with interest. Your father did beautiful work. I was sorry to hear of his passing. You know my father, in a manner of speaking. He once did some consulting work. On a manner of speaking, he once did some consulting work on a vessel for my family's company, Aldridge Maritime. Perhaps you've heard of us, Jordan Maritime. Aldridge Maritime. Aldridge Maritime was one of the oldest shipping companies in the Pacific Northwest, founded in the 1890s. They'd been a power in Port Cascade for generations, until they'd moved most operations to Seattle in the 1980s.
What do you want, Miss Aldridge? The older woman settled into a chair without invitation. I want you to understand what you've stumbled into. The Pacific Destiny isn't simply an abandoned cargo ship. It's evidence of the largest maritime smuggling operation in this region's history, an operation that has corrupted Port Cascade for 3 generations. Gordon sat down slowly. I'm listening. In 1994, my father was CEO of Aldridge Maritime. The company was struggling, facing competition from larger corporations. He made a deal with certain parties in Port Cascade to use our ships for alternative cargo. I didn't know about it at the time. I was working in our Seattle office, focused on legitimate operations. Catherine's expression hardened. By the time I discovered what was happening, the operation had been running for years. Gold bullion, stolen art, bearer bonds, all manner of smuggled goods moving through Port Cascade. The Pacific Destiny was one of the main vessels involved. Why are you telling me this? Because the people running that operation are still in power in this town. They control the Port Authority, local law enforcement, even the mayor's office. When the Pacific Destiny's engine fire forced it to be abandoned here in 2017, they couldn't risk salvaging it themselves, too much exposure. So they've kept it isolated, waiting for an opportunity to quietly reclaim what's hidden aboard. The gold, Catherine nodded. Among other things, I've spent the last 6 years gathering evidence, trying to expose the corruption. But these families are deeply entrenched. They've blocked every attempt to investigate. So what do you want from me? Help. You've legally purchased the vessel. You have salvage rights. If you document what's hidden aboard and provide that evidence to federal authorities I've been working with, we can finally break their power over this town. Jordan studied the older woman. This sounds like a good way to get killed. It is, Catherine admitted, which is why I'm here in person at night instead of calling. Robert Whitmore, the man who contacted you earlier, he's their lawyer. He'll offer you money, then threats, then worse. But if you have the courage to see this through, you could change everything. Why me? Why not handle it yourself? Because I'm an Aldridge. They watch me constantly. But you're just a mechanic who got lucky at an auction. They underestimated you, which gives us an advantage. By the time they realize what you're really doing, it will be too late. Jordan thought about the gold sealed in the hull, about the fresh tool marks in the engine room, about her father's dying business. I need time to think. Catherine stood. You don't have much. By tomorrow they'll increase pressure. Within a week they'll try more direct methods. She pulled out a business card. This number reaches me directly. When you're ready to move forward, call me. I have contacts in the FBI's Maritime Division who can protect you. After Catherine left, Jordan sat in the silence of her workshop, surrounded by the ghosts of her father's work. Outside, Port Cascade slept, unaware that the abandoned ship in its harbor held the key to decades of corruption. Jordan pulled out her phone and looked at the photos she'd taken of the gold bars, of the serial numbers, of the welded compartments, evidence of crimes that had shaped her town's history, hidden in plain sight for years. She could take Whitmore's offer, walk away clean, let the secret stay buried, or she could finish what her father might have started if he'd known the truth. She could tear open the Pacific destiny and expose everything festering inside it. Jordan Hayes had always believed that good mechanics didn't just fix symptoms, they found the root cause. By morning, she'd made her decision. The Pacific destiny was going to give up its secrets, and Port Cascade was going to face its past. Whether she survived the process remained to be seen. The next morning arrived with the kind of grey drizzle that defined Pacific Northwest autumns, a persistent mist that wasn't quite rain, but soaked through everything given enough time. Jordan stood in her workshop at 5:47 a.m., 3 hours before she'd told Marcus to meet her, surrounded by equipment she'd been gathering since Catherine Aldridge left the night before. On the workbench lay a systematic inventory, 2 high-resolution cameras with waterproof housings, a handheld ultrasonic thickness gauge for measuring metal density, a fiber optic inspection camera that could snake into tight spaces, latex gloves, evidence bags, a portable scale, and a hardcover notebook for detailed documentation. Next to these sat something she'd retrieved from her father's old safe, a Geiger counter he'd kept from his Navy days, still functional after all these years. Jordan hadn't slept. Every time she'd closed her eyes, she saw that gold bar, felt its weight, calculated its implications. But more than the gold itself, what haunted her was the question of how it got there and why it had stayed hidden for so long. She'd spent hours researching maritime law, smuggling cases, and the history of Port Cascade. What she'd found painted a picture that made Catherine Aldridge's story not just plausible but probable. Port Cascade had always existed in a gray zone, too small for major federal attention, large enough to handle significant cargo, and remote enough that discretion came naturally to its residents. The town's golden age had been the 1960s through 1980s, when shipping companies had used it as an alternative to the more expensive ports in Seattle and Tacoma. But that prosperity had come with whispers, always whispers. Cargo that moved at night, ships that arrived without proper manifests, families that became wealthy through channels no one could quite explain. Her research had led her to old newspaper archives, digitized and buried in library databases. A 1994 article about a Coast Guard investigation that had gone nowhere. A 1998 piece about the mysterious closure of a federal probe into port operations. A 2003 story about the suicide of a customs inspector who'd allegedly been taking bribes, though his family insisted he'd been murdered. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to look, corruption woven so deeply into Port Cascade's infrastructure that it had become invisible, just the way things worked. Jordan's phone buzzed, a text from Marcus, "Can't sleep either. Coming in early. Need to talk." 20 minutes later, Marcus arrived carrying a manila folder, and looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. He dropped the folder on the workbench and sat heavily on a stool. "My cousin called me back at 3 a.m., he said without preamble. "He made me promise not to tell anyone he told me this, but the Pacific destiny is part of a federal cold case. In 1994, the FBI suspected it was being used to smuggle high-value contraband. They had an informant on the crew, a guy named Danny Reeves. He disappeared before he could testify. They found his body 3 months later in a shipping container in Oakland. Official cause of death: accidental suffocation." Jordan felt ice in her stomach. They killed their own crew member. The investigation stalled after that. No witnesses would talk. The ship changed registry, moved to different routes. By 2000, the feds had moved on to other cases. The file went cold. Marcus pushed the folder toward her. My cousin sent me what he could access. It's not much, but it's something. Jordan opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of old FBI reports, witness statements that had been heavily redacted, and a photograph of Danny Reeves, a young man with a nervous smile and a tattoo of an anchor on his forearm. One document caught her attention, a partially redacted memo dated March 1994, discussing suspected coordination between vessel crew and local port officials, and referencing estimated cargo value in excess of $50 million. Someone had written in the margin, Aldridge Maritime Connection. Catherine Aldridge wasn't lying, Jordan said quietly. Her family's company was involved, which means everyone she named last night probably knows about the gold, Marcus replied. Jordan, these people killed someone to protect this secret in 1994. What do you think they'll do now? Before Jordan could answer, her phone rang. Robert Whitmore, right on schedule. She put it on speaker. Mr. Whitmore. Miss Hayes, have you considered our offer? His voice was as smooth as the night before, but Jordan detected a slight edge underneath. I have. My answer is no. A pause, longer than before. That's unfortunate. May I ask why? Because I'm a mechanic, Mr. Whitmore. When something doesn't work right, I like to understand why. That ship has secrets, and I want to know what they are. Curiosity can be dangerous, Miss Hayes. The pleasant tone had evaporated. My clients are prepared to increase their offer to $500,000, but only if you sign today. After that, the offer expires permanently. Tell your clients, I'm not interested in selling. Then let me be crystal clear. Whitmore's voice went cold. You have no idea what you're interfering with. People who've tried to expose these matters in the past have met with unfortunate accidents. Fire can be particularly devastating to marine repair facilities. All those chemicals, the fuel, the welding equipment, one spark in the wrong place. Jordan's hand tightened on the phone. Was that a threat, a warning, for your own safety? You have until 5 p.m. today to reconsider. After that you'll need to accept the consequences of your decision. The line went dead. Marcus's face had gone pale. You just threatened to burn down your shop, which means we're running out of time. Jordan stood, gathering the documentation equipment. We go to the ship now, document everything we can find, and get it to Catherine Aldridge's FBI contacts, before Whitmore can make good on his threats. This is insane, probably. You coming? Marcus grabbed his jacket. Someone needs to keep you from getting killed. They loaded the equipment into Jordan's truck and drove through the empty pre-dawn streets of Port Cascade. The town looked different in the grey light, less like a struggling community, and more like a place holding its breath, waiting for something to break. As they approached Pier 7, Jordan noticed a security guard, stationed near the entrance, a new addition since yesterday. She recognized him, Dale Pritchard, who'd been fired from Hayes Marine 2 years ago for showing up drunk. He'd apparently found new employment. Jordan pulled up to the gate. Dale stepped out of his booth, recognition crossing his face. Morning, Dale. Jordan, sorry, but this area's restricted now. Port Authority orders. I own the ship at Pier 7. I have salvage rights. Dale looked uncomfortable. Yeah, about that. There's been some kind of paperwork issue. You're going to need to talk to the Port Authority office before you can access the vessel. What kind of paperwork issue? They didn't tell me specifics. Just said no one goes near that ship without clearance. Jordan felt Marcus tense beside her. This was Whitmore's doing, trying to block their access, while maintaining plausible deniabilities. Dale, you know me. You know I bought that ship legally. Whatever they told you is. I'm sorry, Jordan. I've got my orders. He tapped back toward the booth, reaching for something. A phone, probably to post the booth. Reaching for something. A phone, probably, to call whoever put him here.
Jordan made a split-second decision. She gunned the engine, the truck lurching forward. Dale jumped aside with a shout. A shout. A side shout past the gate. And it's outside with a shout. A shout. Escape blew past the gate. And itself not subtle. That was not subtle. Marcus yelled, bracing himself against the dashboard. Subtle stopped being an option when they threatened to bracing himself against the dashboard. Subtle stopped being an option when they threatened to bracing himself against the dashboard. Subtle stopped being an option when they threatened to burn down my shop. They reached the pier and jumped out, belt, carrying equipment. Behind them, Jordan could hear Dale shouting into his phone. They had minutes. Jordan could hear Dale shouting into his phone. They had minutes, maybe less, before security or police arrived. The climb up the maintenance ladder was harder carried or police, but maintenance. They reached the main deck as the first siren became audible.
They reached the main deck as the first siren became audible in the distance. Engine room, Jordan commanded. We document the gold, get photos of everything, then get out. They descended through the superstructure at a run, their flashlights bouncing off bulkheads as they navigated the familiar route to the engine room. The watertight doors seemed to close behind them with ominous finality. In the engine room, Jordan went straight to the hull section they'd opened yesterday. She pulled out the camera and began methodically photographing the welded compartments, the hidden spaces, the stacks of gold bars visible in her flashlight beam. "How many do you think there are?" Marcus asked, his own camera documenting from different angles. "Dozens, maybe hundreds." Jordan pulled out the ultrasonic gauge and began scanning the hull, mapping the extent of the modifications. The readings suggested the hidden compartments ran at least 60 feet along the engine room's length. She was reaching for another gold bar to photograph its serial numbers when her flashlight caught something else, tucked behind the gold in one of the compartments. A waterproof case, the kind used for important documents. Jordan pulled it out carefully and opened it. Inside were folders, papers sealed in protective plastic. She recognized some of the letterhead: Aldridge Maritime, Port Cascade Harbor Authority, even FBI case files. "Marcus, look at this." The documents were explosive. Manifest showing smuggled cargo, bank records linking local officials to offshore accounts, crew rosters with Danny Reeves's name highlighted, and most damning, a detailed ledger documenting 30 years of smuggling operations, with dates, cargo descriptions, and payments made to specific individuals. "This isn't just evidence of one crime," Marcus breathed. "This is evidence of everything, everyone involved. It's a complete record." Jordan photographed every page, working as fast as she could while maintaining documentation quality. The sirens outside were getting closer, multiple vehicles from the sound of it. She was halfway through the second folder when she found a document that made her blood run cold, a list of security incidents dating from 1987 to 2017. Danny Reeves's name was there, marked Resolved 0594, but there were others. A customs inspector in 1998, a journalist in 2003, a federal investigator in 2009, each marked Resolved with dates that presumably indicated when they'd been silenced. "They've been killing people for 30 years, Jordan whispered. A sound from above made them both freeze. Footsteps on the deck, multiple people, moving with purpose. "Jordan Hayes." A voice echoed down through the hatches, amplified and authoritative. "This is Port Cascade Police. You're trespassing on restricted property. Come out immediately with your hands visible." Marcus looked at Jordan with wild eyes. "We're trapped down here." Jordan's mind raced. The engine room had emergency exits, required by maritime safety regulations. She'd studied the ship's layout last night. There should be an escape ladder that led to the main deck near the bow, far from where police were likely concentrating. This way. She grabbed the waterproof case with the documents and led Marcus toward the forward section of the engine room. Behind a generator housing, she found what she was looking for, a narrow vertical shaft with a ladder leading upward. They climbed, equipment bags banging against the shaft walls. The ladder seemed to go on forever, Jordan's shoulders burning from the previous day's work. Above them, daylight showed through a small hatch. Jordan pushed the hatch open, and they emerged onto the forward deck, behind a cluster of winches and cargo equipment that provided cover. She could see police officers near the main superstructure, 3 cars with lights flashing on the pier below. "We need to get off this ship without them seeing us," Marcus panted. "The forward mooring lines." Jordan pointed to thick cables that connected the ship to bollards on the pier. "We can climb down." "You're joking. Those cables are 50 feet. You have a better idea." They didn't. They secured the equipment bags across their backs and approached the mooring cables. Jordan went first, wrapping her legs around the thick steel cable and beginning the hand-over-hand descent. The cable was slick with moisture, her hands already burning from gripping it. Below, the concrete pier waited unforgivingly. She was 20 feet down when one of the officers spotted them. A shout went up, and suddenly all attention was focused on the 2 figures, descending the mooring line like the world's most desperate pirates. Jordan dropped the last 10 feet, landing hard but rolling with the impact the way her father had taught her during childhood roughhousing. Marcus landed beside her less gracefully, his ankle twisting slightly. They ran. Behind them, officers were scrambling back to their vehicles, trying to cut off escape routes. Jordan's truck was blocked in, useless. They sprinted toward the warehouse district, ducking between buildings, using every shortcut and alley that 28 years in Port Cascade had taught them. They emerged near the old cannery district, a stretch of abandoned buildings that had been closed since the 1980s. Jordan led them into a structure she'd used as a hideout in high school, through a window that still opened if you knew the trick. Inside, they collapsed against a wall, gasping for breath. Sirens wailed in the distance, searching. "That went well," Marcus managed between breaths. Jordan pulled out the waterproof case and her camera. "But we got it. Everything. The gold, the documents, photographic evidence of the whole operation. And now every cop in town is looking for us. Which means we can't go to local police." Jordan pulled out her phone and found Catherine Aldridge's card. The call was answered on the first ring. "Miss Hayes, I have it. Everything. Documents, photographs, evidence of 30 years of smuggling and multiple murders. But Port Cascade police are after us." Whitmore moved faster than we expected. A pause while Catherine processed this. "Where are you now?" Jordan described their location. "Stay there. I'm calling my FBI contact immediately. They'll send agents from Seattle, but it will take 2 hours minimum. Can you stay hidden that long?" "We'll have to, Jordan." Catherine's voice was deadly serious. "They'll be looking for you everywhere. If they find you before the FBI arrives, those documents will disappear, and so will you. Do not trust local police. Do not trust anyone in Port Cascade. Do you understand?" "I understand." After the call ended, Jordan and Marcus settled in to wait. The cannery building creaked around them, wind whistling through broken windows. Jordan reviewed the photographs on her camera, ensuring everything was backed up to cloud storage. The documents told a story of systematic corruption that went beyond simple smuggling. They showed how Port Cascade's entire power structure had been built around protecting these operations. The harbor master, the police chief, 3 consecutive mayors, even judges and county commissioners, all either directly involved or paid to look the other way. And at the center of it all, the Whitmore family. Robert Whitmore's father had been the architect of the original scheme in the 1980s. His grandfather before him had run similar operations during Prohibition. It was a legacy of corruption spanning a century. How do people live with this? Marcus wondered aloud, reading over Jordan's shoulder. Knowing they're part of something that got people killed. They tell themselves it's business, Jordan replied. They rationalize it, and after a while, they stop seeing it as wrong. It just becomes the way things are done. An hour passed, then another. The sirens had faded, but Jordan knew the search continued. Whitmore would be coordinating with local police, maybe even security from the families involved. They'd be checking her shop, her apartment, anywhere she might hide. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from his cousin. Heard APB went out for you and Jordan. Officially trespassing and theft charges. Unofficially you need to disappear until feds arrive. Whitmore family putting pressure on everyone. Be careful. At the 2-hour mark, Catherine called back. FBI agents are 30 minutes out. They're sending a tactical team because of the murder allegations in those documents. But Jordan, there's something else. Robert Whitmore filed an emergency injunction, claiming you stole gold that belongs to his clients. He's arguing you have no right to salvage anything from the ship. That's insane. I bought the ship legally. He's also claiming the gold is legally owned property that was being stored aboard under contract, not contraband. He's trying to establish a legitimate ownership claim before the FBI can seize it as evidence. Jordan's mind raced. If Whitmore could establish ownership through court filings, even false ones, it might complicate the federal investigation. Evidence that appeared to have legitimate owners was harder to seize than obvious contraband. He's covering his tracks, she realized, creating a legal framework to explain away the gold, which is why we need to move fast. The FBI agents will meet you at the cannery. They'll take you into protective custody and secure the evidence. Then we go public with everything before Whitmore can construct his legal defense. The wait for the final 30 minutes felt eternal. Jordan kept reviewing the documents, memorizing details, understanding the scope of what they'd uncovered. This wasn't just about saving her business anymore. This was about exposing a system that had corrupted Port Cascade for generations. Finally, the sound of vehicles approached, different from the local police. Quieter, more purposeful. Jordan peered through a crack in the wall and saw black SUVs with federal plates pulling up to the cannery. Agents emerged, wearing FBI windbreakers, moving with professional efficiency. Catherine Aldridge stepped out of one vehicle, followed by a tall woman in her 40s with short, gray hair and sharp eyes that scanned the building with tactical awareness. Jordan and Marcus emerged from the cannery with hands visible. The gray-haired agent approached immediately. Miss Hayes, I'm Special Agent Sarah Reeves, FBI Maritime Division. She paused, seeing Jordan's reaction to the name. Yes, Danny Reeves was my brother. I've been waiting 29 years for someone to give me evidence that could nail the people who killed him. Jordan handed over the waterproof case and her camera. Then this is for your brother. It's all in there, everything. Agent Reeves opened the case, her expression hardening as she recognized familiar case files, documents that had disappeared from federal evidence years ago. Where exactly did you find this? Sealed in the double hull of the Pacific Destiny, along with approximately $76 million in gold bullion, based on my preliminary count. Reeves looked at her team. Get a full tactical unit to Pier 7 immediately. I want that ship secured before anyone else can access it. And someone call the U.S. Attorney. We're going to need warrants for about half of Port Cascade's government. Over the next hour, while sitting in a federal office, hastily established in a secure location outside town, Jordan gave her complete statement. She documented everything: the auction, the discovery of the gold, Whitmore's threats, the documents, the suspicious deaths listed in the files. Agent Reeves listened with the intensity of someone who'd made this case her personal mission. Your documentation is thorough, Miss Hayes. These photographs, the serial numbers on the gold, the witness testimony from Miss Aldridge. This is enough for federal warrants. What happens to the gold? Jordan asked. And the ship? The gold will be seized as evidence and proceeds of criminal activity. Depending on the investigation's outcome, there may be reward provisions for the person who discovered it. As for the ship, Reeves consulted notes. Your salvage rights appear legitimate. Once the ship is released as evidence, you'd retain ownership, though I imagine it will be tied up in federal custody for months, possibly years. Jordan's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You've made a grave mistake, Miss Hayes. This isn't over. She showed it to Reeves, who immediately had text begin tracing it. The agent's expression was grim. We're going to arrange protection for you. These people have a 30-year history of making problems disappear. I can't hide forever, Jordan protested. I have a business, a life. Right now you have a target on your back. Until we've made arrests and secured the evidence chain, you're the most important witness in a federal investigation. Reeves leaned forward. Miss Hayes, the documents you found include evidence of 8 murders spanning 3 decades. These aren't people who'll hesitate to make it 9. The implications settled over Jordan like a shroud. She'd thought finding the gold would save her business. Instead, she'd uncovered something far larger and far more dangerous. By evening, the FBI had established a full command center. The Pacific Destiny was now surrounded by federal agents, the gold being systematically removed and catalogued under chain of custody protocols. Arrest warrants were being prepared for 23 individuals, including Robert Whitmore, the current harbor master, 2 police officers, and several prominent business owners. Catherine Aldridge sat with Jordan in the secure facility, looking 20 years younger despite the late hour. You did it, she said quietly. What I've been trying to do for 6 years. You opened the door. I just wanted to save my dad's business, Jordan replied. I didn't sign up to bring down Port Cascade's entire power structure. Sometimes the right thing and the easy thing are opposites. Catherine smiled. Your father would be proud. He was always suspicious of how things worked in this town. I think that's why he kept that Geiger counter. He believed in being prepared to expose the truth. As midnight approached, Agent Reeves brought updates. We've detained Robert Whitmore for questioning. He's lawyered up, but we have enough to hold him on conspiracy charges. The documents you found reference specific conversations about Danny Reeves's death. That's admissible as evidence of ongoing conspiracy. What about the gold? Marcus asked. Where did it originally come from? We're cross-referencing the serial numbers with international databases. Preliminary results suggest multiple sources. Some bars match a 1992 theft from a Canadian mining company. Others appear connected to South American drug cartels from the late 1990s. This wasn't just smuggling, it was money laundering on a massive scale. Jordan thought about the ship sitting at Pier 7, the hollow vessel that had carried so much more than cargo. How many trips had it made? How many fortunes had passed through its holds? How many crimes had been enabled by the corruption it represented? There's one more thing, Reeves continued. The documents include references to other ships, other operations. The Pacific Destiny was just one part of a larger network. This investigation is going to expand significantly, which means Port Cascade is going to be torn apart, Jordan realized. Port Cascade is going to be cleaned out, Reeves corrected, and then maybe it can rebuild on honest foundations. As the night deepened and the investigation continued around them, Jordan found herself thinking about what came next. Her business was still failing, she was still in debt, and now she was a federal witness with enemies who'd proven willing to kill. But she'd also done something her father never got the chance to do. She'd exposed the rot at the heart of her hometown. She'd turned a key that unlocked not just a hidden cache of gold, but the truth about Port Cascade's corrupted soul. Outside, the first news vans were arriving, drawn by reports of a major federal operation. By morning, the story would be everywhere. The mechanic who bought a cargo ship and found $76 million in smuggled gold. The documents that exposed 3 decades of murder and corruption. The small town whose secrets had finally come to light. Jordan Hayes had gambled everything on a rusted hulk, destined for scrap. What she'd found had been worth far more than gold. She'd found the truth, and the truth was about to set Port Cascade free, whether it wanted to be or not. The media storm hit Port Cascade like a hurricane at dawn. By 6 a.m., every major news network had satellite trucks positioned around the Federal Command Center, around Pier 7, and outside the homes of those named in the investigation. Helicopters circled overhead, capturing aerial footage of FBI agents systematically removing gold bars from the Pacific Destiny's hull. The images were spectacular, agents in tactical gear, waterproof cases being loaded into armored trucks, the massive cargo ship surrounded by federal vessels. Jordan watched it unfold from a secure hotel room in Tacoma, 30 miles from Port Cascade, where Agent Reeves had relocated her and Marcus for safety. The television showed her workshop, reporters standing outside Hayes Marine Services, describing the struggling mechanic who uncovered the Pacific Northwest's largest smuggling operation. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing. Journalists, lawyers, even a producer from Netflix wanting to discuss documentary rights. She'd turned it off after the 100th call. "You're famous," Marcus observed from the other bed, scrolling through social media. "Someone made a TikTok about you. It has 3 million views. Great. I always wanted to be known as the woman who destroyed her hometown's economy, because that was the other story unfolding." As arrests were made throughout the morning, Robert Whitmore taken from his waterfront mansion in handcuffs, the harbor master escorted from his office, 2 police officers suspended pending investigation. Port Cascade's business community was reeling. Companies that had operated for decades were suddenly under federal scrutiny. Bank accounts were frozen. Properties were seized. The morning news showed interviews with confused residents. A woman who worked at the harbor authority, now unemployed, claiming she'd known nothing about corruption. A fishing boat captain whose permits were under review because he'd used harbor services, now deemed compromised. People whose lives were being upended by revelations they claimed to have never suspected. "They're calling you a hero and a traitor in the same breath," Marcus said, reading comments. "Some people are grateful. Others are saying you should have taken Whitmore's money and kept quiet." Jordan turned away from the screen. Her business was still failing. She was still in debt. And now she'd made enemies of some of the most powerful people in the region. The gold might be worth millions, but she had no claim to it. It was evidence in a federal case, its ultimate disposition, years away from being decided. A knock on the door made them both tense. Agent Reeves entered, followed by Catherine Aldridge and a man Jordan didn't recognize, late 50s, expensive suit, the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Miss Hayes, this is Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Brooks, Reeves introduced. He's taking lead on prosecuting the case. Brooks settled into a chair, opening a briefcase. Miss Hayes, I want to start by thanking you for your courage. The evidence you've provided is extraordinary. We're building cases against 23 defendants, with the possibility of more, as the investigation expands. How long will this take? Jordan asked. Years realistically. White-collar conspiracy cases are complex. We're talking about RICO charges, money laundering, murder conspiracy, maritime smuggling. The defense will fight every step. Brooks pulled out documents. Which brings me to your situation. You're going to be our star witness. That means depositions, grand jury testimony, eventually trial testimony, if cases go that far. I can't hide in a hotel room for years. You won't have to. We'll establish a protection protocol. You'll be able to return to your business, but with security measures. He paused. However, I need to be honest about something. Your business is going to struggle. Port Cascade's maritime industry is effectively frozen during this investigation. Many of your potential clients are under scrutiny. The town's reputation is damaged. Jordan had already known this, but hearing it stated so bluntly still hurt. So what do I do? Catherine Aldridge spoke up. You rebuild, not just your business, but Port Cascade itself. That's why I'm here. She pulled out her own documents. Aldridge Maritime wants to return operations to Port Cascade. We'll need local marine services, facilities management, all the things your business provides. I'm prepared to offer Hayes Marine Services a 5-year contract, guaranteed minimum $2 million annually, to serve as our primary maintenance provider. Jordan stared at her. Why would you do that? Because Port Cascade needs honest businesses to survive. Because you've proven your integrity. She'd bought a scrap ship for $180,000, expecting to maybe clear $400,000 in salvage. Instead, she'd uncovered $76 million in gold, exposed a criminal conspiracy, and might receive a reward worth more than she could have imagined. What about the ship itself? She asked. The Pacific Destiny. Your salvage rights remain valid, Brooks confirmed. Once we've completed evidence collection, probably 6 to 8 months, the vessel reverts to your ownership. What you do with it then is your decision. The morning progressed with more briefings, more documents, more plans. By noon, the first arrest hearings were beginning in federal court. Jordan watched on television as Robert Whitmore was arraigned, his lawyer arguing that he was merely an attorney representing legitimate clients, that any criminal activity was unknown to him. The judge set bail at $5 million. But the real drama came when the harbor master Gerald Thornton, a cousin of Robert Whitmore, decided to cooperate. In exchange for reduced charges, he provided testimony about the operation's inner workings, naming names and detailing how smuggling runs had been coordinated for 3 decades. His testimony was devastating. He described how ships would arrive with special cargo that bypassed normal customs, how manifests would be altered, how inspectors would be bribed or threatened, how anyone who asked too many questions would find themselves transferred, fired, or worse. The Pacific Destiny was supposed to be stripped and scrapped in 2017, Thornton testified, his voice flat and defeated. But the gold was still inside. We couldn't access it without drawing attention. So we kept the ship in bureaucratic limbo, paying minimal harbor fees, waiting for an opportunity to quietly reclaim it. Why didn't you remove the gold earlier? The prosecutor asked. Because we didn't know exactly where in the ship it was hidden. The original crew, who sealed it in the hull, were gone. dead or disappeared. We knew it was in the double hull somewhere, but cutting into random sections would have been obvious. We needed the ship to look like legitimate salvage while we searched. So when Miss Hayes purchased the vessel, it was perfect. A legitimate salvage operation that we could monitor and, if necessary, control. We planned to have our people strip the ship, discover the gold, and claim it through false ownership documents. Miss Hayes was supposed to take our buyout offer and walk away, but she didn't. No, she didn't. Thornton's expression was bitter, and now here we are. By the second day, the scope of the conspiracy was becoming clearer. The FBI had traced the gold to 7 different major crimes, spanning 20 years: mining company thefts, cartel money laundering, even bars stolen from a reserve bank robbery in South America. The Pacific Destiny had been a floating vault for criminal proceeds from across 2 continents. More arrests followed. A retired judge who'd dismissed smuggling cases. A customs official who'd falsified inspection reports. Business owners who'd provided legitimate fronts for money laundering. Each arrest unraveled more threads, exposing more corruption. Port Cascade was in shock. Town meetings grew heated as residents grappled with the revelation that their community's prosperity had been built on criminal foundations. Some denied it, insisting the accused were innocent. Others expressed outrage at having been kept in the dark. A few, mostly older residents, admitted they'd always suspected something but had been too afraid to speak up. On the 3rd day, Agent Reeves allowed Jordan to return to Port Cascade under escort. She needed to see her business, assess the damage, begin planning for whatever came next. Hayes Marine Services looked smaller than Jordan remembered. More vulnerable, but it was intact. No fires, no vandalism. A few reporters lingered outside, but FBI presence kept them at a distance. Inside, her small office was exactly as she'd left it 3 days ago. Her father's tools still hung on the walls. His desk still held the coffee mug he'd used every morning. The smell of diesel and metal still permeated everything. Marcus joined her, looking around with sad nostalgia. "What do we do now?" "We work," Jordan said simply. "Catherine's contract won't start for a month. Until then, we have bills to pay and equipment to maintain. We keep going. With half the town calling you a traitor, with half the town learning what the other half was really doing." Jordan pulled out her father's old ledger, the one where he'd tracked every job, every payment, every promise kept. "Dad built this business on honest work. We're going to rebuild it the same way." Over the following weeks, Port Cascade began its painful transformation. Federal investigators continued their work, but daily life slowly resumed a new normal. Some businesses closed, unable to survive without the corrupted relationships they depended on. Others adapted, finding legitimate clients and operating without the hidden advantages corruption had provided. Jordan found herself in an unexpected position, bridge between the old Port Cascade and whatever came next. People who'd been hurt by the conspiracy sought her out, sharing their stories. A woman whose husband had been fired for questioning suspicious cargo. A fisherman who'd lost his boat because he wouldn't cooperate with smugglers. Families whose relatives had died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Each story reinforced that exposing the truth, however painful, had been necessary. The Pacific Destiny remained at Pier 7, now a tourist attraction. People came from across the region to see the infamous ship, take photos, post on social media. The Port Authority, under new federal oversight, was considering turning it into a maritime museum once the investigation concluded. Jordan visited it one morning, 6 weeks after the initial discovery, accompanied only by Agent Reeves. They climbed the maintenance ladder and stood on the main deck, looking out across Puget Sound. "My brother would have loved this," Reeves said quietly. "Seeing justice finally served, knowing his death meant something. I'm sorry you waited so long, 29 years, but it was worth it to see Whitmore and the others in federal custody." Reeves turned to Jordan. "You should know. Whitmore's lawyers are trying to cut a deal. He's offering to testify against the bigger fish, the ones who organized the smuggling from the beginning. Could lead to even more arrests." "How many people were involved?" "We're estimating 50 to 75 directly. Hundreds more who knew but stayed silent. Port Cascade wasn't just corrupted. It was designed to be corrupt from the start." Reeves paused. "There's something else. We found evidence that your father suspected the smuggling. He documented suspicious ship movements, unusual cargo handling. Nothing concrete, but enough to show he was paying attention." Jordan felt tears prick her eyes. He never said anything. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he was gathering evidence. We'll never know. Reeves pulled out a folder, but he kept these records. They're part of the case file now. "Your father was trying to expose this, Jordan. You finished what he started." That night, alone in her workshop, Jordan spread out her father's notes that Agent Reeves had copied for her. Dates, ship names, observations about cargo that didn't match manifests. He'd been building a case, slowly and carefully, probably planning to take it to federal authorities eventually. But he died before he could. And now his daughter had completed his work. 3 months after the initial discovery, the first trials began. Robert Whitmore, facing overwhelming evidence, accepted a plea deal, 20 years in federal prison in exchange for testimony against others. His cooperation led to additional arrests in Seattle, Portland, even Los Angeles. The smuggling network had been vast, touching dozens of ports and hundreds of lives. Gerald Thornton received 15 years. The corrupt police officers got 10 each. Others received varying sentences based on their involvement. In total, 37 people were convicted or pleaded guilty to charges stemming from the Pacific Destiny case. The gold was eventually liquidated at auction, bringing $78.3 million. Jordan's whistleblower reward was set at 20%, $15.66 million, paid out over 3 years to minimize tax implications. She used the first payment to pay off all of Hayes Marine Services' debt, modernize the equipment, and hire back the employees she'd been forced to let go. The second payment went into trust funds for the families of those who'd been killed protecting the conspiracy's secrets, including Danny Reeves's nieces and nephews. The third payment she saved, for the future, for whatever came next. Catherine Aldridge made good on her promise. Aldridge Maritime returned to Port Cascade with a major facility investment, bringing hundreds of legitimate jobs. Other companies followed, drawn by federal incentives for businesses willing to invest in the recovering community. The Pacific Destiny was eventually decommissioned from federal evidence and returned to Jordan's ownership. She donated it to the newly formed Port Cascade Maritime History Foundation, which converted it into a museum documenting both the region's legitimate maritime heritage and the darker chapter that had finally been closed. On the museum's opening day, 2 years after Jordan had first climbed aboard the rusted hulk, she stood on the main deck with a crowd of several hundred people. The ship had been cleaned, restored, its engine room preserved exactly as it had been when she'd discovered the hidden gold. "This ship represents a choice," Jordan said in her dedication speech, uncomfortable with public speaking, but determined to say what needed saying. "The choice between easy money and honest work, between silence and truth, between preserving corruption and exposing it no matter the cost." She looked out at the audience,
Federal agents who'd worked the case, families of victims finally finding closure, Port Cascade residents who'd lived under corruption's shadow for generations. My father taught me that being a mechanic isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about understanding why things break in the first place. Port Cascade was broken for a long time, but now we have a chance to rebuild it the right way, on honest foundations, with transparent systems, where people succeed because of their work, not because of who they know or what they're willing to ignore. The museum opened to strong attendance. Visitors walked through the engine room, where Jordan had discovered the gold, read about the investigation, learned about the lives affected by decades of corruption. It became a destination for law enforcement training, for ethics courses, for anyone interested in how systemic corruption takes root and how it can finally be uprooted. Hayes Marine Services prospered. With Catherine's Contractors Foundation, Jordan expanded operations, hired 20 employees, invested in new technology. She focused on sustainable maritime practices, renewable energy systems for ships, everything her father had dreamed about, but never had the resources to pursue. Marcus became her business partner, officially handling the growing complexity of contracts and operations. They moved into a new facility, modern and efficient, but Jordan kept her father's old tools on the wall of her office, a reminder of where she'd come from. Port Cascade slowly healed. It would never be the same town it had been. Too much had been exposed, too many illusions shattered. But in some ways, it became better, stronger, more honest, more honest, more honest. New businesses emerged, run by people who'd been shut out under the old corrupt system. Families who'd left during the decline began returning, drawn by opportunities that were finally based on merit rather than custom.
5 years after buying the Pacific Destiny, Jordan stood on the deck of a modern container ship undergoing maintenance at Hayes Marine Services' expanded facility. The ship was clean, efficient, running on hybrid power systems Jordan's team had installed. Everything was documented, inspected, legitimate.